The knock in the dead of winter. The door nearly came off its hinges. 3 fists, not knocking, hammering, shook Clara Whitmore out of the only sleep she'd managed in 2 days. The blizzard outside had been screaming since sundown, and she had told herself nothing alive could be moving through that kind of cold. She had almost believed it. She grabbed the rifle before her feet hit the floor. "Who's there?" Not a question, a warning. The answer that came back wasn't words. It was a sound she hadn't expected. A child's cough, thin and ragged, barely cutting through the wind. Clara stood at that door for 3 full seconds, her hand on the bolt, her father's voice in her head. "You open that door to a stranger in the dark, Clara, and you deserve whatever walks in." She opened it anyway. The man standing on her porch was half frozen and nearly black with cold, and he was holding a small boy against his chest like the child was the only thing in the world worth protecting. The boy's lips had gone the color of a February sky, pale, almost gray, and his eyes were closed. The man looked at Clara. His jaw was set so hard she could hear his teeth grinding even over the storm. "Please," he said. Just that. One word, like it cost him everything he had left. Clara stepped back and let them in. She would spend a long time afterward asking herself why. She never came up with a clean answer. Some decisions don't come from thinking. They come from somewhere older than thought. That was the night everything changed. She just didn't know it yet. No. If you were standing at that door, alone, in the dark, with a rifle in your hands, and a half-dead stranger on the other side, what would you have done? I'm so glad you're here. If this story reaches you, press like and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because what happens next will stay with you long after the storm clears. Clara Whitmore had been living alone on that ridge for 14 months. People in the valley below, in the town of Coldwater Flats, 7 miles down a road that was barely a road even in summer, had opinions about that. Most of them weren't kind. A woman alone up there, they said, was either running from something or had lost her mind entirely. Sometimes they said both. What they didn't say, because most of them didn't know, was that Clara had lost her mother at 16, her father at 24, and her younger brother Thomas to a fever the winter before last. She hadn't run from anything. She'd simply looked around one morning and realized there was no one left to run toward, and the cabin was paid for, and she knew how to work the land, and she was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that lives in your chest, not your legs, of pretending she needed saving. So she stayed. The cabin sat on the eastern shoulder of a ridge the old maps called Harlan's Back, which was a name that told you everything about what kind of country it was. It was not beautiful country, not in the way people meant when they called things beautiful. It was harsh and enormous and indifferent, and it could kill you 9 different ways in January. And Clara had come to love it with the fierce, private love you develop for things that ask nothing of you except that you be strong enough to deserve them. She had a milk cow named Bess, who was getting old and producing less every season. She had 12 laying hens, down from 20 because of a fox she'd tracked and shot in October. She had a root cellar with enough stores to last through March if she was careful, and she had been careful. Careful in the way that had started to feel less like practicality and more like punishment, like she was rationing herself down to the minimum required to technically be alive. She had a rifle her father had taught her to shoot with her left hand because she'd broken her right arm at 11 and it had healed slightly wrong, and she had become a better shot with that left hand than most men were with either. That was one of the small, hard-won facts of her life that she carried quietly. The way you carry something you know has value but don't need to announce. She did not have neighbors. The nearest homestead was the Delacroix place, 4 miles south. And old Marcel Delacroix had gone to live with his daughter in Cheyenne in September, and the place stood empty now. She had not spoken to another person since a supply run to Coldwater Flats in early November, when she'd bought flour and lamp oil and a new file for her hatchet from the feed store, and the clerk, a boy named Perry, who couldn't have been more than 17, had looked at her like she was a curiosity in a glass case. That had been 6 weeks ago. The blizzard had started building 2 days before the knock came. Clara had felt it coming the way she always felt weather coming now, in her shoulders and in something at the back of her throat, some animal instinct she'd developed without meaning to. She'd spent those 2 days doing what needed doing, checking the barn latches, bringing extra wood to the porch, banking the fire in a way that would hold heat through the night, checking the lamp oil, checking the rifle. She'd gone to bed that night with the storm already howling and told herself nothing would be moving through that until morning. She'd been wrong. The boy's name was Eli. She learned that first before she learned anything else, because the man set the child down on the floor in front of the fire, and the first thing he said, after Clara had stepped back from the door and let them in and thrown the bolt again against the wind, was, "Eli, Eli, we're inside now. You're warm. Say something." The boy opened his eyes. They were dark brown, very dark, and enormous in his thin face. He looked around the cabin with the unfocused look of someone who has been cold so long they've stopped being sure what they're seeing is real. "Are we dead?" he asked. His voice was a thread. "No," Clara said, before the man could answer. She was already moving to the fire, adding wood, not looking at either of them directly, because she needed a moment to think, and she couldn't think if she was looking at the child's gray lips. "You're not dead. You're in my cabin. There's a fire." "Oh," Eli said, and then his eyes closed again, but differently. Not the way they'd been closed outside, not the terrible stillness of a body shutting down, but the way a child's eyes close when they finally feel safe. The difference between those two kinds of closed was something Clara understood in her chest before she understood it in her mind. She turned to the man. He was still standing near the door, dripping meltwater onto her floor, his coat so stiff with ice it had barely shifted when he moved. He was tall, taller than she'd registered in the doorway, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a jaw covered in several days of dark beard. His hands, she noticed, were shaking, not from fear, from cold. There was a difference in that, too. "How long were you out in that?" she said. "Since around 4 o'clock. He said it without drama, like a man reporting a fact. "We came off the trail above the ridge. Horse broke through a drift and we had to abandon her. Walked the last 2 miles. Clara looked at Eli, then back at the man. 2 miles in that storm with a child who weighed maybe 50 pounds. She didn't say anything about that. "Get his coat off," she said. Get his boots off. Check his fingers and toes. If they've gone white and don't hurt when you press them, tell me immediately." "I know," the man said. Something in the way he said it, not defensive, not elaborating, just "I know," made Clara look at him more carefully. He was already crouching beside Eli, working the frozen laces of the boy's boots with hands that were barely functional, doing it methodically, in the right order, the way someone does a thing they've been trained to do rather than figuring it out as they go. She went to get her extra blankets. She had 2. She'd been saving the second one because blankets on this ridge weren't a luxury, they were a survival calculation, and she hadn't planned on needing to keep 2 people warm tonight. She brought them both out anyway without letting herself think about it too hard. The man's name, she learned over the next hour, was Nathaniel Voss. He offered it the way he offered everything in those first hours. Minimally, without decoration. He had been traveling south from Montana, he said, with his son, heading toward warmer country. The storm had caught them on the high trail. "Traveling in December," Clara said. It wasn't exactly an accusation, but it wasn't not one either. "Yes," he said. She waited for more. He didn't offer it. She had a pot of bean soup she'd made 2 days ago, still sitting in the cold part of the kitchen where it kept well. She heated it over the fire and watched Nathaniel Voss feed it to his boy in small, careful spoonfuls, waiting between each one the way you wait with a sick child, patient in a way that didn't look performed. Eli ate 4 spoonfuls and fell properly asleep. Nathaniel sat back on his heels and looked at his son for a moment with an expression Clara recognized without being able to name exactly. Something between relief and a grief so old and worn in it had become indistinguishable from ordinary breathing. "Thank you," he said. He looked up at her then, and she saw his eyes clearly for the first time. Dark gray, like the sky had been before the storm hit. "I know you didn't have to open the door." "I know I didn't," Clara said. She went to make coffee because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the conversation was starting to feel like something she didn't have a category for, and she preferred to keep herself busy in situations like that. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the fire with her rifle across her knees and watched the storm and watched the man and the boy and told herself she was being practical. She watched Nathaniel Voss take off his coat, eventually, and hang it near the fire. And she saw that he was lean but not underfed, the kind of lean that comes from outdoor work, not from want. She saw the way he checked the boy's temperature with the back of his hand every hour. She saw him notice, without commenting on it, when the fire got low, and get up and add wood from her stack without being asked. That last thing was the one that stayed with her. He didn't ask. He also didn't take over. He put 2 logs on, not 4, like a man who understood that the wood wasn't his and was using only what was needed. It was a small thing. She didn't know yet why it mattered to her so much. By morning, the storm had not broken. Eli woke up flushed but functional, and the first thing he said, before he even seemed to fully register where he was, "Pa, the lady's cat is staring at me." Clara did not, in fact, have a cat. She had a barn cat named Moth who lived in the barn by preference and came inside only when she absolutely wanted to, and Moth was currently sitting on the back of the chair nearest the fire, 6 inches from Eli's face, studying him with the calm, investigative stare of an animal that has decided it is in charge of determining whether this small human is acceptable. "That's Moth," Claire said. "She's deciding if you're worth her time." Eli stared at the cat. "How do I make her think I am?" "Don't try," Claire said. "She hates when people try." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then very carefully, he turned away from the cat and looked at the fire instead. Moth stepped off the chair back, walked across the floor, and sat down directly next to Eli's knee. "Huh," Eli said. "Huh," Clara agreed. Nathaniel, across the room, watched this exchange with the careful stillness of a man who has learned not to react to things too visibly in front of strangers. The second day was strange in the way that unexpected intimacy with strangers is always strange. The awareness that you're performing ordinary life in front of people who don't know what your ordinary life looks like, and the weird self-consciousness that comes with that. Clara made oatmeal and split it 3 ways without comment. Nathaniel asked where she kept her tools. Not if he could use them, but where they were. And she told him, and he spent the morning working on the loose board in the floor near the back wall that she'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. She watched him figure it out without asking for instructions, find the nails without asking where they were, do it quietly and correctly. She didn't know what to do with a man who just fixed things without making a production of it. Eli, once it was clear he wasn't going to fall down or run a fever, turned out to be exactly the kind of child that adults who don't spend time with children sometimes find alarming. Curious without being disruptive, direct without being rude, prone to long silences followed by very specific questions. He asked Clara how old the cabin was. He asked her why the window in the bedroom faced north instead of south. He asked her, with the grave courtesy of a child who has been taught to be considerate, whether she minded if he looked at her books. She had 11 books. She'd read all of them so many times she could have quoted sections by heart. She told him he could read whatever he wanted and watched him select, with the same careful deliberation his father used for everything, a battered copy of David Copperfield that had been her mother's. "Good choice," she said. He looked up at her. "Have you read it?" 4 times. He considered this. "Then can I ask you questions about it?" "If you get stuck," Clara said. "I won't get stuck," Eli said, and went back to reading. Clara stood there for a moment, feeling something in her chest that she did not have a clean name for. It was warm and uncomfortable at the same time, the way feeling returns to a hand that's been too cold. Not painful exactly, but sharp, a reminder that sensation is possible. She'd forgotten that children could make you feel that. The storm held another day. 3 people and a cat and an old cow and 12 hens in a cabin on a ridge in Wyoming in December. Clara did what needed doing, the animals, the water, the food, and Nathaniel Voss did what needed doing alongside her, without discussion, without asking for credit, fitting himself into the rhythms of the place the way water finds the shape of whatever holds it. On the 3rd night, with Eli asleep and the storm finally beginning to tire itself out, Clara and Nathaniel sat on opposite sides of the fire and drank coffee in silence for a while, and Clara decided to say the things she'd been not saying. "You're not just a cowboy passing through." Nathaniel looked at his cup. "What makes you say that?" "The way you checked Eli's hands when we came in. The way you did that floorboard. The way you talked to him." She paused. "The horse." His eyes came up. "The horse. I saw her when you came in. Even half frozen, I could see what she was. That's not a working cowboy's horse. That's a horse that costs more than most men make in a year." He was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the storm was pulling back, and the silence it left was the kind that feels enormous after so much noise. "She was a gift," he said finally, "from someone I used to know." Clara looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to tell me who you are. I'm asking you to tell me whether me letting you in was a mistake." He met her eyes then, and something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, more like a door opening an inch. "No," he said. "It wasn't a mistake. I swear that to you." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then she refilled her coffee and let it go. That was another thing she'd learned on this mountain. Not every question needed its answer tonight. Some truths had their own season, and pushing them before they were ready only broke things. She'd pushed her father too hard the last year of his life, trying to get him to tell her where the money had gone, why the land taxes were so far behind, what he'd gotten himself into. He'd died before she got her answers, and she'd spent months after that trying to untangle the mess he'd left, and she still wasn't sure she'd gotten to the bottom of it. She'd learned to wait, but she hadn't learned to stop noticing, and she was noticing things about Nathaniel Voss that she didn't know what to do with. The way he spoke, he caught himself sometimes, mid-sentence, and simplified what he was about to say, like a man switching from a language he's been trained in to one he's decided is more appropriate for the company. The way he carried himself, even exhausted, even cold. There was something in his posture that wasn't cowboy, that was something else, something that spoke of rooms with high ceilings and people who stood a certain way because they'd been taught to since they were children. The horse, the boy's manners, the hands that knew how to fix things, but also had an old roughness that was different from the kind you got from starting rough and staying rough. She noticed all of it, and she put it away and went to sleep, and in the morning the storm had broken, and Nathaniel Voss was awake before her, standing at the window looking out at the white world like a man trying to determine exactly how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. "You can stay," she said from the doorway, "until the road clears. It won't be safe for a few days." He turned and looked at her. "That's generous." "It's practical," she said. "The road down is buried. You'd be out there with a child in post-storm cold that's worse than the storm itself, and I'd spend the next week wondering if you made it. This is easier." He almost smiled. It didn't quite reach his eyes, but it got close. "All right," he said. That was the beginning of the second week. And in that second week, something happened that Clara hadn't planned for, hadn't left room for, hadn't even known she was missing until it arrived. The cabin started to feel like a place where people lived, instead of a place where one person survived. Eli finished David Copperfield in 4 days and did, in fact, ask questions. Not because he was stuck, as he'd said he wouldn't be, but because he had opinions, strong ones, about the characters, and he wanted to argue them with someone. He thought Dora was more interesting than Agnes. He thought Uriah Heep was frightening not because he was evil, but because he was right that the world had treated him poorly, and that was worse than just being evil. Clara sat at the kitchen table listening to a 9-year-old dismantle the moral architecture of a Victorian novel with the focused intensity of a scholar, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. "You're not wrong about Heep," she said. "I've thought that too." Eli looked at her with the particular satisfaction of a child who has been taken seriously by an adult. It was a look she recognized. She'd spent a lot of her own childhood wanting it and not always getting it. Nathaniel was in the barn when this conversation happened. She could hear faintly the sound of him working on something out there. One of the stall boards had been loose since October, and she'd mentioned it the day before in passing, not as a request, just as a fact. And he'd been out there for 2 hours now. She made lunch. She called them both in. They ate together at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, And Eli talked about David Copperfield, and Moth knocked a tin cup off the shelf for no discernible reason, and Nathaniel caught it without looking up from his food and set it back down. And Clara laughed. It came out of her without warning, real and unguarded, and she saw Nathaniel look at her with an expression she didn't have time to parse before she looked away. 4 days later, she caught him going through her supply inventory. She came into the kitchen and found him with her ledger open on the table, the ledger where she kept track of what was in the root cellar, what was running low, what she needed to get before the next snowfall. He looked up when she came in, and he didn't try to close it quickly or explain it away. "Your flour won't last to March," he said. "I know," she said. She kept her voice level. "That's my ledger." "You left it on the shelf. I wasn't—" He paused. "I shouldn't have opened it. I apologize." She looked at him. He'd said it directly, without qualification, and he hadn't tried to make the apology about anything other than what it was. "What else did you see?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Enough to know you're managing lean. The cow's production is down. You're short on lamp oil. There's a note in the back about a tax payment. That's not your business." "No," he said. "It's not." He closed the ledger and slid it toward her across the table. "I'm sorry, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She hadn't told him not to, but she noticed it. She picked up the ledger. "The taxes are behind. My father, he left things complicated. I'm working through it." She said it more than she'd meant to. She didn't know why she said it. She put the ledger back on the shelf and told herself the conversation was over. "I could take the horses down to Coldwater Flats when the road clears," Nathaniel said. "Get your flour and the oil before the next front comes in." "I don't need you to do that." "I know you don't need me to," he said. "I'm offering because the road will be better in a few days than it will be in a week, and because you're low on flour." Clara looked at him for a long moment. There was something exhausting about arguing with a man who wasn't arguing back. It left you with nothing to push against. "Fine," she said. He went 2 days later, leaving Eli with Clara in the cabin, which was itself a thing she hadn't expected. That he trusted her with his son without making a production of that trust, without extracting promises or giving instructions beyond "he doesn't like the crust on bread if it's too hard, just so you know." He said it with a complete lack of self-consciousness, like a man reporting a fact about the weather. Clara had not been alone with a child since Thomas died. She had not let herself think about that directly. She and Eli spent the day quietly. He read. She worked on the mending pile she'd been putting off for a month. Moth stayed inside, which was unusual. Moth almost never stayed inside during daylight. She seemed to have decided that Eli was her specific responsibility, and she took this seriously. At midday, Eli put down his book. He'd moved on to a collection of short stories she hadn't looked at in years, and said, without preamble, "My mother died 2 years ago." Clara set down the sock she was mending. "I'm sorry," she said. "Pa doesn't talk about it," Eli said. He was looking at the fire, not at her. "But sometimes I see him looking at things the way he used to look at her, and I think he's still talking to her, in his head." Clara did not say anything. She understood that kind of conversation, the kind you have in your head with people who are gone. She'd been having one with her brother Thomas for 14 months. "She would have liked it here," Eli said. "She liked places that were real. She used to say that." He looked at Clara then. "This place feels real." Clara looked around her cabin. The mismatched furniture, the books with their cracked spines, the window with the crack in the upper corner she'd patched with newspaper and wax because she hadn't been able to afford new glass. The quilt on the chair that her mother had made, faded now and repaired in 3 places with different fabric because that was what you did with things you couldn't replace. "It's real," she said. "It's not much else, but it's real." "That's what I mean," Eli said, with great seriousness, and picked up his book again. Nathaniel came back that evening with the flour and the oil and a half-dozen other things she hadn't asked for. Dried beans, a new wick for the lamp that had been running thin, 2 oranges that he'd gotten somewhere, God knew where in December, and set them on the table without ceremony. "The road's holding," he said. "Another week, maybe." Clara looked at the oranges. She hadn't had an orange since the previous spring. "You didn't have to—" "I know," he said. She made dinner. Eli told his father about David Copperfield and Uriah Heep and the moral complications of sympathetic villains with the same focused intensity he'd used with Clara, and Nathaniel listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, with the full weight of his attention. Clara watched this. She watched the way Nathaniel's face changed when he looked at his son, the particular softness that appeared there and nowhere else, the way the guardedness he kept around himself like a coat dropped away without his seeming to notice. She thought, this man has lost a great deal and is afraid of losing more. She thought, I know what that feels like. She thought, this is dangerous. She peeled an orange and gave half to Eli and half to Nathaniel, and kept nothing for herself. And neither of them said anything about that, and she told herself it was because she wasn't hungry. The weeks stretched, and the road stayed difficult, and there were 3 more days before it would truly be safe enough to make the full run down to Coldwater Flats. And they all 3 knew it, and none of them mentioned it. On the last night of that second week, when Eli was asleep and the fire was low, and the silence between Clara and Nathaniel had reached the particular quality of a silence between 2 people who have stopped pretending to be merely practical about each other's company, there was a sound at the edge of the property that wasn't the wind. Clara heard it first. She was on her feet and at the window before she'd consciously decided to move. What is it? Nathaniel said, quiet and immediate, already standing. Someone on the property, she said. She was looking out the dark window, seeing nothing. Maybe nothing. Maybe an animal. What kind of animal comes to a cabin door in December? He said it flat, not like a joke. She reached for the rifle. He didn't tell her she didn't need it. He moved to the other window, and she noticed then, really registered for the first time, the way he positioned himself between her and the door, without making it visible that's what he was doing. They stood like that for a full minute. Nothing moved. The night stayed still. Whatever had been at the edge of the property was gone, or had never been what she thought, or had decided it didn't want to be found. Clara lowered the rifle. She was breathing too fast. She'd gotten soft, she thought. Weeks of people in the cabin, of coffee in the mornings, and conversation over food, and a child who asked her questions, and a cat who had adopted someone other than her for the first time in years. And she'd let herself go soft, let herself forget that she was a woman alone on a mountain with no one but herself between her and whatever the dark brought. You should know, Nathaniel said quietly behind her, that whatever's coming, I'm not going to let it follow me to you. And she turned and looked at him. He was watching the window with his face very still and his eyes doing that thing they did sometimes, reading something she couldn't see, calculating something she didn't have enough information to calculate with him. Whatever's coming. She didn't ask, not yet, but she felt the ground shift very slightly under the place where she thought she was standing, and she understood that something was about to change, and she didn't know yet whether the knock at her door 11 days ago had been the best or worst thing that had ever happened to her. The fire cracked. Moth moved from the foot of Eli's pallet to the door and sat there, looking at it, tail wrapped around her feet. And Clara Whitmore stood in her own cabin with a rifle in her hands and watched the cat watch the door, and thought, I opened it once. I'd open it again. The thought surprised her. She put it away and stood watch until morning came. Morning came gray and brutal, the kind of cold that follows a blizzard like a punishment for surviving it. The temperature dropping another 10 degrees once the wind stopped, the world going still and sharp and merciless under 2 feet of new snow. Clara was up before the light. Old habit, older than the mountain, older than the grief. The animals needed what they needed regardless of what had happened the night before, regardless of the fact that she'd stood at her own window until 3 in the morning watching the dark and listening to nothing. She pulled on her coat and her boots and took the rifle off the hook by the door and went to the barn without waking either of them. She fed Bess first. The cow was restless, shifting her weight, blowing steam in the cold air of the barn. Clara pressed her forehead against the animal's broad neck for a moment, something she'd done since she was a child, something that had always helped her think, and stood there in the smell of hay and animal warmth and tried to sort out what she was feeling. She couldn't quite do it. The feelings weren't cooperating enough to be sorted. She checked the barn perimeter before she went back inside, walked the full edge of the property, her boots punching through the snow crust with every step, looking for tracks. She found them 20 yards north of the cabin, not animal tracks, boot prints, 2 sets, both large, coming from the direction of the lower trail. and stopping at the edge of the tree line. They'd stood there for a while, whoever they were. The snow was packed down in a rough circle where they'd shifted their weight. Then the prince turned and went back down the trail. They'd looked at the cabin, counted the light in the window maybe, and then they'd left. Claire stood over those tracks for longer than she should have in the cold, reading them the way her father had taught her to read ground. Not just what was there, but what it meant, what it told you about the person who'd left it. Two men, standing still, watching, leaving without doing anything, which was almost more unsettling than if they'd come to the door. She went back inside and said nothing about it. Not yet. Nathaniel was awake and had coffee on. He looked at her when she came in, looked at her boots, at the snow on her coat, at her face, and she saw him register all of it without asking. He poured her a cup and set it on the table. "Road's going to be passable tomorrow if it doesn't cloud over again," she said. "I know," he said. Eli was still asleep. Moth was on the bed next to him, curled against his legs, which was a level of attachment from that cat that Clara had never seen directed at another human being, and she'd had Moth for 3 years. She drank her coffee and watched Nathaniel slice bread for breakfast and thought about boot prints and what a man stands in the cold watching a lit window for. And she thought about what Nathaniel had said the night before. "Whatever's coming, I'm not going to let it follow me to you." And she decided to ask the question she'd been putting off. "Who knows you're in this part of Wyoming?" He didn't stop slicing the bread, but his hands changed, just slightly, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. "No one who should," he said. "That's not the same as no one." He set the knife down. He turned and looked at her with the gray eyes that she'd spent 2 weeks trying to read and hadn't cracked yet. "There are people who've been trying to find me," he said. "I knew that when we left Montana. I thought I'd put enough distance between us." He paused. "I may have miscalculated." "What kind of people?" He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that isn't evasion so much as a man deciding how much of the truth he can afford to give and still be honest. "Business people," he said finally. "Men who believe I owe them something." "Do you?" "No." He said it without heat, without defensiveness. Just flatly, the way you state a thing you've been certain of for long enough that the certainty has gone bone deep. "No, I don't. But what I owe and what they believe I owe are two different things, and they have the money and the lawyers to make the difference between those two things very difficult." Clara looked at him. "Are you in trouble with the law?" "No." "Are you lying to me?" "No," he said again, the same way. "I'm not lying to you. I'm not telling you everything, but I'm not lying." She thought about that distinction. There was something almost painful about how precisely he'd drawn it, like a man who'd thought about the line between those two things very carefully and was committed to staying on the right side of it even when the cost was high. "The tracks outside," she said. "There were 2 of them, standing at the tree line last night. They watched the cabin and then they left." He went very still. "Which direction?" "Back down the lower trail, toward the road." He turned away from her and put both hands on the counter and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she could see the muscles in his shoulders doing something she recognized, the body absorbing a blow and trying not to show it. "I need to be gone by tomorrow," he said. "The road? I'll manage the road." He turned back. His face was controlled again, carefully controlled. The door shut. "I'm sorry, Clara. I'm sorry I brought this to you. That was never—" He stopped. "I'll be gone tomorrow, both of us." Eli was standing in the doorway to the back room. Neither of them had heard him wake up. He was holding David Copperfield. He'd apparently taken it to bed with him, and looking at his father with eyes that were not the eyes of a child who has just woken up. They were the eyes of a child who has been awake for a while and has heard more than he was meant to. "We're leaving?" he said. "In the morning," Nathaniel said. He said it gently, but not softly. The way you speak to a child you respect enough not to soften things for unnecessarily. Eli looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at his book. "Okay," he said, and went to sit by the fire and didn't say anything else. Clara watched him and felt something pull at her sternum, something she had no interest in examining directly. She poured a second cup of coffee and brought it to the table and sat down and looked at the grain of the wood, and thought about what she should do. What she did was ask Nathaniel to help her with the fence on the south side of the property because it needed doing and because she needed to talk to him outside, away from Eli, and work was the only frame she knew for conversations she wasn't sure how to have. They worked for 2 hours in the cold, pulling wire and driving posts, and for most of that time they didn't speak. It was an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who've been in a small space together long enough that the pressure to feel quiet has worn off. And Clara was aware that this itself was unusual. She wasn't someone who found quiet with other people easy. She'd found it easy with Thomas. She hadn't expected to find it with anyone else. "The taxes my father left behind," she said between posts. "It's $1,040. Nathaniel looked at her. "I'm not telling you so you'll do something about it," she said immediately. "I'm telling you because you opened my ledger and because I don't want you leaving tomorrow thinking I'm in worse trouble than I am. I have a plan. It's slow and it's going to take 2 more years and the margins are terrible, but it's a plan." He drove the next post in silence. Then, "What's the plan?" "I've been taking in mending and alterations from the women in Coldwater Flats. One of them, Vera Hayworth, she's a dressmaker. She started passing my name around after I fixed a wedding dress that her assistant had cut wrong. It's not a lot, but it's consistent. And combined with what I get from selling eggs and the extra from Bess, I can pay down the debt by about $60 a quarter." He did the math. She could see him do it. 2 years isn't so bad," he said. "It's 2 years of everything going right," she said. "The cows staying healthy, the hens not getting sick, the mending work not drying up." She paused. "Out here, everything going right for 2 years is not a thing you count on." He didn't offer her solutions. She'd half expected him to, and he didn't, and she found she was more grateful for that than she could easily explain. He just drove another post into the frozen ground and moved to the next one, and the unspoken acknowledgement between them was that she'd told him something real about her life, and he'd received it without trying to fix it. "The people looking for you," she said. "Would they come here, to the cabin?" "They might," he said. "They're looking for leverage. If they knew—" He stopped, revised. "If they thought you mattered to me, they'd use it." Clara processed that, the grammar of it. If they thought you mattered to me, the fact that he hadn't said if they thought I mattered to you, which was a different sentence with a different weight. She let it go. She was good at letting things go. It was one of the skills the mountain had given her, and she wasn't always sure whether to be grateful for it. They went back inside for lunch, and the afternoon was unremarkable. Eli read, Nathaniel repaired a hinge on the back window that had been sticking. Clara worked on an alteration she'd been putting off, a man's coat that Vera had sent up with the last supply run, and the three of them moved around each other in the small space with the ease that had built up so gradually she hadn't noticed until now how natural it felt, how the cabin had redistributed itself around 3 people instead of 1 without her consciously rearranging anything. This, she thought, was the dangerous part. Not the men at the tree line, not whatever Nathaniel was hiding from. This, the ordinary afternoon, the hinge fixed, the coat hemmed, the boy reading by the fire, this was the thing that could do her the most damage because it was the thing she'd been longest without, and you could get used to it so fast it made your head swim. She was halfway through the coat when Eli looked up from his book and said, without particular preamble, "Are you good at arithmetic, Clara?" "Decent," she said. "Pa is very good at it," Eli said, in the tone of someone making an observation they've made many times. "He does sums in his head that most people need paper for." "That's a useful thing to be able to do," Clara said. "He taught me," Eli said. "We practice when we ride. He gives me problems and I have to figure them out before we reach the next landmark." Clara glanced at Nathaniel. He was focused on the hinge, but the set of his shoulders had changed slightly, the way they did when he was paying closer attention to something than he appeared to be. "What kind of problems?" she said. "Real ones," Eli said. "Like, if a train is carrying 500 tons of freight at 11 miles an hour and needs to cover 300 miles, and it has to account for grade and wind resistance." "Eli," Nathaniel said from the window. Quiet, not sharp. Eli stopped. He looked at his father's back. He looked at Clara. He looked at his book. "Math problems," he said. Clara looked at Nathaniel's back. She looked at the hinge he was working on. She looked at her coat. If a train is carrying 500 tons of freight, she thought about who taught a 9-year-old to calculate freight loads and grade resistance in his head as a game during a horseback ride. She thought about what kind of life would make that a natural thing to teach your child. She thought about what Nathaniel had said about business people, about men who believed he owed them something. She thought about the horse in her barn, the one that cost more than most men made in a year. She thought, I've been putting together a picture of this man from pieces and trying not to look at the full shape of it because I'm not sure I want to see it yet. She finished the coat. The night passed quietly. Whatever had been at the tree line didn't come back, or if it did, she didn't hear it. She actually slept, which surprised her. And in the morning, she woke to the sound of Nathaniel moving around in the kitchen and the smell of coffee and something else, something that took her a moment to identify as bacon, which meant he'd gone into her stores without asking again, but differently this time, not reading her ledger, cooking breakfast, feeding her, and she didn't know what to do with that distinction, so she got up and let it be what it was. He was going that morning. He'd said so. The road was passable. She didn't ask him to stay. She'd known from the beginning this was temporary. She'd been careful not to let herself forget that. But then Eli came in from the back room and sat at the table and said, Pa, the cat slept on my feet all night. I don't think I should leave her. Nathaniel looked at his son. Moth belongs to Clara. I know, Eli said very seriously, but I don't think she knows that anymore. Clara looked at the cat, who was sitting on the back of Eli's chair in her position of maximum authority, staring at Nathaniel with the specific disdain she reserved for people who were saying things she disagreed with. Clara looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her. There was something in his face that was almost helpless. The expression of a man who has planned for most contingencies and has not planned for this one. One more day, Clara said. She hadn't meant to say it. The road south is passable, but the junction at Perkins Creek is still buried. You'll get stuck there with the boy. This was true. It was also not the only reason she said it, but it was true. Nathaniel held her eyes for a moment. One more day, he said. But the day that followed was not like the days before. The rider appeared before noon. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. A single horse coming up the road from the valley, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and wasn't in a hurry because he didn't need to be. The horse was good. The saddle was better. The man on it was wearing a coat that cost more than Clara's whole winter store, and he sat in it the way men sit in expensive things when they've always had them, without noticing. She said Nathaniel's name once, quietly, and he was at the window beside her in 4 steps. She heard something happen in his breathing. Just once. Just a fraction of a change, and then it was gone, and his face was stone. Who is that? She said. His name is Harlan Poole, Nathaniel said. He's a lawyer. He works for, He stopped. He finds people. He's very good at it. What does he want? To deliver a message. He moved away from the window. Stay inside, Clara. I'll handle this. This is my property. I know it is. He was already pulling on his coat. That's why I'm asking you to stay inside. Because if you're out there, he knows you exist, and it's better for you if he doesn't. She watched him go out the front door and pull it closed behind him. She stood at the window and watched him walk out to meet the rider. And she watched the rider pull up and look down at Nathaniel with the particular expression of a man who has been looking for someone for a long time and has the satisfaction of that behind his eyes. She couldn't hear what they said. She could read bodies, though. Nathaniel's squared and still and giving nothing, the lawyer's loose and confident, the confidence of a man who doesn't need to threaten because what he's carrying is threat enough. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. She counted. Then the lawyer turned his horse and rode back down the trail, and Nathaniel stood in the snow and watched him go, and didn't move for longer than was necessary. He came inside with snow on his shoulders and an expression that Clara couldn't read at all, which was new. She'd been reading him for 2 weeks and hadn't hit a wall like this before. What did he say? She said. Nathaniel looked at Eli, who was in the doorway, book still in hand, reading them both. Eli, Nathaniel said, go put your things together. Eli didn't move immediately. He looked at his father with those two old dark eyes, and something passed between them that Clara couldn't intercept. The language of two people who've been through a great deal together and have developed codes for it. Then Eli went to the back room. The door didn't close fully. Clara suspected it was deliberate. "Tell me what he said," she said, keeping her voice low. "He said my—" Nathaniel stopped, started over. "There's a man named Garrett Crowley. He's been buying land in this part of Wyoming for the past 2 years, pushing out smaller homesteaders. He's got a railroad contract coming, and he needs the right-of-way." He paused. "He needs this land." Clara felt the floor shift slightly under her. This land. The ridge, the lower 40, and the parcels on either side. He's already got the Delacroix land. He bought it in October. The Delacroix land. Marcel Delacroix, who'd gone to live with his daughter in Cheyenne in September. Gone to live with. Or been bought out. Or pushed out. "And Poole is working for Crowley," she said. "Yes. And Crowley knows you're here. He knows someone is here with you. He doesn't know—" Nathaniel stopped again. He had a particular way of stopping in the middle of sentences that she'd noticed from the beginning, the habit of a man who measures out what he gives very precisely. "He doesn't know who I am yet, but he'll find out. And when he does—" Nathaniel looked at her directly then, and there was something in his face that she thought she'd seen before. In the doorway that first night, when he'd been holding Eli and asking her with one word to let them in. That same stripped-down quality, everything else cut away. "When he does," he said, "it will make things more complicated, for both of us." "You keep saying complicated," Clara said. "I need you to use a different word. I need you to tell me what is actually happening." He held her eyes for a long moment. "Garrett Crowley has been claiming that certain land in this region, including your 40 acres, was never properly registered after the Homestead Act provisions lapsed. He's been using that claim in court to push through purchase orders at fractions of the real value. Your father's land—" He paused. "The taxes that are behind. He's been buying debt. He may already hold a portion of your tax note, Clara." She stood very still. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the $1,040. She thought about 2 years of everything going right. "He's been buying the debt," she said, to make sure she'd understood. "It's how he operates. He doesn't push people out directly. He makes the financial ground under them unstable enough that they sell to him because they think they have no other choice." Clara looked at her kitchen. The wood stove, the shelf with the 11 books, the cracked window she'd patched with newspaper and wax. She thought about her father and the complicated mess he'd left, and how long she'd spent trying to figure out where the money had gone. She thought about whether that mess had been partly created, pushed along by someone who wanted the land under the cabin. She felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "And you," she said. "What does any of this have to do with you?" He sat down at the kitchen table. She had never seen him sit like that before. Not with exhaustion, not with defeat exactly, but with the particular weight of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has temporarily stopped arguing with the weight. "My family," he said. "My family built the Vossington Northern Line. You've heard of it." She had. Everyone in Wyoming had heard of the Vossington Northern Line. It was one of the 3 major rail systems in the territory, worth more money than Clara could meaningfully imagine. She looked at the man sitting at her kitchen table. At the coat he'd been wearing for 2 weeks that was good quality, but not what a rich man wore. At the hands that knew how to drive fence posts and fix hinges and cook breakfast and check a child's fingers for frostbite. "Voss," she said. "Not Vossington." "I left," he said, 6 years ago. After my wife died, and I didn't want it. Any of it. I took Eli and I left, and I've been living on what I earned because it was the only way I could figure out how to live like a person instead of a name." Clara sat down across from him. "But the name didn't stop being worth something," she said. "No," he said. "The name is worth a great deal to Garrett Crowley, because Crowley's railroad contract is competing with Vossington Northern, and if he could get me to sign off on a merger agreement, or if he could get enough leverage to force my hand." He rubbed the back of his neck. "My leaving didn't remove me from the family trust. It only removed me from the day-to-day. I still hold a third of the controlling interest. I just never use it. Clara sat with this. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the back room, Eli was being very quiet. You came through this part of Wyoming by accident, she said slowly. Or you didn't. He met her eyes. I was following a route that I thought would get us south without crossing any of Crowley's territory. I miscalculated how far his reach extended. He paused. The blizzard was not part of any plan. No, Clara said. I didn't think it was. She stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the road where the lawyer's tracks were still visible in the snow, leading back down to the valley, back to wherever Garrett Crowley was waiting. She thought about what it meant that Crowley might already hold part of her debt. She thought about what it meant that the land she'd been working herself half to death to hold on to was sitting in the middle of someone else's battle. She thought about her father and the money that had gone somewhere, and whether the somewhere had a name on it she'd recognize now. She felt angry. Not at Nathaniel. She was working her way to the bottom of how she felt about Nathaniel and hadn't reached it yet. She was angry in a cleaner way than that, the way you're angry when you discover that something that felt like your own struggle has actually had someone else's hand in it from the start. The fence we fixed yesterday, she said, mostly to the window. Yes, Nathaniel said quietly. And the floorboard. And the hinge. Yes. Were you doing that because... No, he said it firmly. No. I was doing that because it needed doing, and I was here and I had no money to give you, and I couldn't think of any other useful thing to offer. She turned and looked at him. There it was again, that quality she hadn't known what to call, stripped down, nothing decorative. I believe you, she said. She wasn't sure she'd meant to say it, but she did believe him, and she'd learned a long time ago that the only thing worse than saying a hard truth out loud was knowing it and keeping it to yourself until it curdled. Eli appeared in the doorway. He was carrying his bag. Small, worn leather, the bag of a child who has learned to pack light because moving has become ordinary. He looked at his father and then at Clara with those eyes that saw too much. Are we going? He said. Nathaniel looked at Clara. She looked at the boy with his worn leather bag and his copy of David Copperfield tucked under his arm. He'd taken it, she noticed, as if he'd forgotten it was hers, or as if he'd decided he wasn't leaving without it. And she looked at the cat, who had appeared from nowhere and was now sitting next to Eli's feet with the air of an animal that has made a decision and sees no reason to discuss it. She looked at the road outside, at Harlan Poole's tracks disappearing down toward the valley. She looked at Nathaniel. No, she said. Not yet. He started to speak. If Crowley already holds part of my debt, she said before he could, then this is already my problem too. You leaving doesn't change that. It just changes whether I face it alone. She heard herself say it and didn't take it back. I want to see the paperwork on the land, whatever you know about how he operates. I want to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I decide what to do about it. Nathaniel held her eyes. Something moved through his face that she'd call relief if she thought he was the kind of man who let himself feel that too visibly. I have papers, he said, in my saddlebag. I should have shown you sooner. Yes, she said. You should have. He went to the barn. Eli set his bag down and sat at the table and put David Copperfield in front of him and did not open it, just rested his hands on it and looked at Clara with an expression that she recognized. It was the expression she'd seen in her own mirror at his age, the look of a child who has learned to be very careful about hoping for things. She put the kettle on, because that was what she did when things were hard and she didn't have a better answer. And she thought about Garrett Crowley, a man she'd never met, who had apparently been quietly pulling at the threads of her life from below, and she felt the anger settle into something colder and more solid and more useful. She had held this land through a brutal winter and 2 years of grief and a debt that should have broken her. She had fixed her own fences and slaughtered her own chickens and patched her own window with newspaper and wax, and she had done it without asking anyone for help because there was no one to ask. She was asking now, though. She could feel it in herself. Not weakness, something else. Something that was the opposite of what she'd been doing. She was letting the problem get larger than one person's ability to carry it. Nathaniel came back with a leather satchel and set it on the table and spread out papers that told a story she'd been living in the middle of without knowing. And Clara Whitmore sat down and began to read. And the shape of the fight she was in finally came clear. It was worse than she'd thought, and she'd thought it was pretty bad. But she'd been on this mountain for 14 months, and she had not broken yet, and she did not intend to start now. The papers told a story in the cold language of legal documents, which was somehow worse than plain speech. The way injustice looks more permanent when it's written down in formal ink on official paper, when it has case numbers and filing dates, and the signatures of men in offices who never set foot on the land they were deciding the fate of. Clara read for a long time. Nathaniel sat across from her and let her read without interrupting, without explaining, which she appreciated because she needed to understand it herself, in her own order, before she heard anyone else's version of it. What the papers said, piece by piece, was this. Garrett Crowley had been operating through 3 different land acquisition companies, each with a different name, each registered in a different county, so that the pattern of what he was doing wasn't visible from any one county seat. He'd been buying tax-delinquent notes, the paper debt that accumulated when homesteaders fell behind on their territorial taxes, for pennies on the dollar, then using those notes to file accelerated collection claims that gave the landowners 60 days to pay in full or forfeit. 60 days was not enough time. He knew it wasn't enough time. That was the point. Clara found her father's name on the 3rd page. Whitmore, Robert A. Tax note number 4471, Harlan County. Original debt, $1,040. Note acquired by Crowley Land Holdings, LLC. November 14th. November 14th. 6 weeks ago. While she'd been up here counting flour sacks and rationing lamp oil and telling herself she had a plan, the note had already changed hands. She'd been paying toward a debt that was no longer held by the county. She'd been paying Garrett Crowley without knowing it. She set the paper down on the table carefully because she needed to set it down carefully or she was going to crumple it, and crumpling it wouldn't help anything. "He bought it in November," she said. "Yes." Nathaniel's voice was even. He wasn't flinching from it. She gave him credit for that. "And the 60-day clock?" "Started the day he filed the acquisition, which was November 16th. She counted in her head. Her face must have done something because Nathaniel said quietly, "January 14th. 18 days. She had 18 days before Garrett Crowley could move to file a forfeiture claim on her land. She sat with that number for a moment. 18 was not nothing. 18 was enough days if she moved fast and thought clearly and didn't spend any of them feeling sorry for herself, which she had no intention of doing. "What do you need from me?" she said. Nathaniel looked at her with something that flickered through his eyes and was gone. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm asking what you need, from me, because we have 18 days and it seems like we ought to be spending them usefully." He was quiet for a moment. Then he seemed to make a decision. She watched him make it, watched the shift in his posture, the door opening just slightly wider than it had been. "What I have," he said, "is information about how he operates. And what I have that he doesn't know I have is standing. In the Vossington Trust, in the Territorial Land Office, with the Federal Railroad Commission." He paused. "I left all of that. I didn't use any of it, but I didn't give it up. I could never quite bring myself to give it up entirely." "Why?" He glanced toward the back room, where Eli had retreated again with his book. "Because Eli didn't choose to leave it. I made that choice for him, and I didn't think it was right to take away something that was also his before he was old enough to decide for himself." Clara looked at the papers on the table. She thought about a man who walked away from a fortune but kept the paperwork for his son's sake, carrying that weight through Montana winters and down blizzard trails, protecting a child who was already carrying more than he should have to. She thought about her own father, who'd left her a different kind of paperwork, debt and confusion, and a puzzle she'd been untangling for over a year, and the comparison sat in her chest at a complicated angle. "Show me what you're thinking," she said. He pulled his chair around to her side of the table, and they went through it together. The documents, the filing dates, the names of the 3 Crowley land companies, the pattern of acquisitions, the trail of bought debt stretching across 4 counties. Clara had always been good with numbers and better with patterns, and within an hour she could see the whole shape of what Crowley had built and where its weak points were. There were three. The first was that the acquisition of her father's note had happened while Crowley's third company was already under a complaint in the territorial court, a technicality, but a real one, that might invalidate the purchase. The second was that two of the properties he'd acquired in the past 6 months had been homesteads registered under the 1879 Federal Act provisions, which meant the territorial courts didn't have sole jurisdiction. There was a federal layer that Crowley appeared to be ignoring or hoping no one would notice. The third was Nathaniel, a third of the controlling interest in Vossington Northern Line, walking around in a worn coat in a Wyoming cabin, doing fence repairs and cooking breakfast. If that interest was used, not to merge with Crowley, but to formally block his railroad contract application, Crowley's entire acquisition scheme collapsed, because the land he was buying was worthless to him without the contract. "You could do that," Clara said. "Block the contract." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "But you'd have to step back into the name to do it." "Yes." She looked at him. He was looking at the papers. "Is that why you haven't done it already?" she said. "Not just for yourself. Because stepping back in means—" "It means Eli becomes Eli Vossington again," he said. "It means the life I built for us. The small, real life. It's over. People look at him differently. He starts having things done for him that he should learn to do himself. He becomes an heir instead of a boy." He stopped. His mother and I disagreed about a lot of things toward the end, but we agreed about that. We agreed that we didn't want him to grow up thinking the name was the same as the person. Clara thought about Eli, the 9-year-old who had charmed a deeply antisocial barn cat and argued the moral philosophy of Victorian literature at a kitchen table and packed his own bag without complaining when he thought they were leaving. She thought about what kind of boy became that. "I think," she said carefully, "that the name versus person question may already be settled in his case." Nathaniel looked at her. "He's already the person," she said, "whatever name he carries next." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. Outside, the sky was doing something with the light that suggested another cloud front coming in. Not a blizzard, maybe, but more snow, the kind that would keep the road uncertain for another day or two. Then Nathaniel said, "There's something else you should know, something I should have told you before." His tone changed on that sentence. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic man, but enough that Clara felt her attention sharpen in a way that was different from before. "Before my wife died," he said, "she had been trying to document something. She came from a family that cared about those things, about paper, about records. She'd been collecting information about a pattern of land fraud in the Northern Territories for nearly a year before she got sick. She thought she'd found evidence of federal mail fraud, which is a different category of crime from what the territorial courts handle. Federal." Clara waited. She gave everything she had to a lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Ashford. His job was to hold it until she either finished building the case or, he paused, or until it became relevant to someone who could use it. "Crowley," Clara said. Her documentation included Garrett Crowley. She'd traced 3 of his acquisition companies back to a single source, a bank in St. Louis that had been laundering the purchase funds through false freight accounts. Freight accounts on a railroad. He looked at her. Vossington Northern freight accounts. Someone inside the company was helping him clean the money. Clara felt the shape of the whole thing settle around her like a building whose walls you finally see clearly once you've stepped far enough back. "She died before she could use it," Clara said. "Yes." "And you took Eli and left." "Yes." "And you left the documentation with the lawyer." "Yes." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "I wasn't in a state to use it. I wasn't in a state to do anything useful for about a year. And then I was. But I'd been out of it long enough that I didn't know who to trust, and the documentation had federal implications that could drag Eli into a proceeding that could last years," Clara said. "Yes." She stood up and took both their cups and refilled them from the pot, and set his back in front of him and stood at the stove with hers, and looked at the far wall, and thought. "The lawyer in Cheyenne," she said. "Ashford. Do you trust him?" "I trust that he wants to be paid," Nathaniel said. which is different from trust, but it's reliable. Can you get word to him without Crowley knowing? If I go through the right channels, there's a man in Coldwater Flats, Renfrew, runs the telegraph office. He's been operating a secondary line for the Federal Land Commission since last spring. It's not public knowledge, but I came across it in the documents. He paused. I believe Crowley doesn't know about it. You believe, Clara said. I'm not certain of anything where Crowley is concerned, Nathaniel said, with a flatness that was its own kind of emphasis. That's the honest answer. Clara nodded. She could work with honest answers, even incomplete ones. They were better than confident wrong ones. 18 days, she said again. 18 days, he agreed. They were quiet together for a moment. Then Eli appeared in the doorway. He'd stopped trying to pretend he wasn't listening, which Clara found she respected, and said, What do we do first? Nathaniel looked at his son for a moment with an expression that was complicated enough that Clara looked away from it. You, Nathaniel said, read your book. I finished it, Eli said. Clara looked at the boy. The shelf, she said. Second row. There's a dark blue one. Wilkie Collins. Try that next. Eli went to the shelf and stood on his toes and found it and looked at the spine and then at Clara. Is it good? It's about secrets, she said, and the damage they do. So yes, it's very good. He took it and went back to the fire, and Clara turned back to Nathaniel, and they got to work. The next 2 days were the busiest she'd had on the mountain since the summer she'd tried to put up the woodshed by herself. Nathaniel rode down to Coldwater Flats the first morning and sent 2 telegrams through Renfrew's federal line, one to Ashford and Cheyenne, one to a contact at the Federal Land Commission, whose name Clara didn't ask for. He was back before noon, moving fast on the road that was better now, the cold having set the snow surface hard enough to travel. He'd also stopped at the Coldwater Flats courthouse. He came back with a look on his face that was controlled but tight around the edges. What? Clara said. The forfeiture clock started November 22nd, he said. Not the 16th. She felt the arithmetic shift. That's 12 days, not 18, he said. I'm sorry, the document I had was a preliminary filing. The formal commencement was 6 days later. 12 days. She stood with that number and felt it press against her. All right, she said. 12. Clara. 12 is enough if we move faster, she said. What did Ashford say? Nothing yet. Telegrams take time. Then we don't wait for telegrams, she said. What can we do with what we have right now, today, in 12 days? He looked at her. That long, level look she'd come to recognize as him taking her seriously, measuring up what she was saying against what he knew. The federal provision issue, he said. The 2 homesteads acquired under the 1879 Act. If someone files a formal federal jurisdiction challenge before Crowley's forfeiture proceedings, it puts everything he's doing on hold while the commission reviews it. Everything, including your land. How long does that review take? Months, maybe longer. And who can file it? Someone with standing under the federal act. He paused. Me. Clara looked at him. Using the name, she said. Yes, I'd have to file as Nathaniel Vossington, which puts me back in the public record, which, he stopped, which is what Crowley wants. My name back in the public record is leverage for him. He can try to force the merger negotiation through the courts, claim that my reappearance in the record constitutes a reinstatement of my obligations under the trust charter. But it would stop the clock on my land. Yes. And on every other homestead he's trying to take. Yes. She looked at the fire. She thought about the 2 settlers on the south side of the valley whose names she'd seen in Crowley's acquisition files. A family named Obert and an old widow named Patterson who'd been on her land for 20 years. She thought about Marcel Delacroix, who'd gone to live with his daughter in Cheyenne and may not have gone entirely willingly. Do it, she said. Clara. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Careful, almost pained. If I file under that name, Crowley knows within the week. He will come here. Not a lawyer this time. I know. You don't... He stopped himself, started again. He has people who don't operate inside the law, Clara. I don't mean he'll send another man in a nice coat. I heard you, she said. Do it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a real question, the kind a man asks when he doesn't understand something and needs to. She thought about how to answer it honestly. Because I've been sitting on this mountain for 14 months, she said, and I've been surviving, and I told myself that was enough, that holding on was the same as living, and maybe it was for a while. But Crowley has been pulling at the threads under me the whole time, and I didn't even know it, and I'm done. I am done sitting here while someone I've never met decides what happens to the ground under my feet. She paused. And because there are other people losing their land too, and they don't know why, and they should. Nathaniel sat very still. That's why, she said. Do it. He went to Coldwater Flats the next morning and filed the federal jurisdiction challenge under his full legal name, Nathaniel Vossington, heir to 1/3 controlling interest in the Vossington Northern Line and territorial land holdings. And when he came back, he looked like a man who has set down a thing he's been carrying for 6 years and is still not sure whether he feels lighter or just different. Eli, who had been told what was happening in terms Clara suspected were both more direct and more complete than most adults would give a 9-year-old, sat at the table that evening and said, "So people are going to know who we are now." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "even here." "Even here?" Eli thought about this. He looked at Clara. "Does it change things? For you?" "Knowing." Clara looked at the boy. She thought about the question, the real question underneath it, the one Eli was too careful and too old in his heart to ask directly. Does knowing who we are make you want us less? "I knew something was different about you from the first week," she said. "It didn't change anything then. It doesn't change anything now." Eli seemed to accept this. He nodded once, gravely, and picked up his book. What changed things was Garrett Crowley. He arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after the federal filing, and he did not send a lawyer this time. Clara heard the horses first, plural, 4 or 5, coming up the road fast and not trying to be quiet about it, which told her something about how he operated. Men who use subtlety send 1 lawyer. Men who want to make a point send 4 horses. She had the rifle off the hook before Nathaniel was fully awake from where he'd fallen asleep in the chair. He was on his feet in seconds, taking in the sound in her face and the rifle in her hands with the quick assessment of a man who processes threat efficiently. "How many?" he said. 4 horses, I think. Maybe 5. "Stay in here." "That's twice you've told me to stay in here," Clara said. "How did that work out the first time?" He looked at her. There was no good answer to that, and he didn't try to manufacture one. "Behind me, then," he said. "Beside you," she said. He held her eyes for 1 second. Then he turned to the door. Garrett Crowley was not what she'd expected, which was a mistake she should have known better than to make, expecting a certain kind of villain and getting another. He was not large or physically threatening. He was somewhere in his 50s, compact and well-dressed in the particular way of men who use clothing to signal precision rather than wealth. And he had the face of someone who had spent decades being the smartest person in most rooms and had stopped bothering to hide that he knew it. He had 4 men with him. They stayed on their horses. He dismounted alone and walked to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Nathaniel and Clara with an expression of almost administrative interest, as if they were a problem he was here to solve efficiently. "Mr. Vossington," he said. He let the name sit in the air for a moment, enjoying the fact that he could use it. "I see you've been enjoying the winter air." "Crowley," Nathaniel said. "I had hoped we could conduct this civilly." He glanced at Clara, at the rifle in her hands. "Perhaps we still can." "Get off my property," Clara said. Crowley looked at her with a shift of attention that was almost like being focused on by a lens. "Miss Whitmore, this is technically a matter of some legal complexity as regards whose property. The federal jurisdiction challenge was filed 4 days ago," Clara said. "You know that or you wouldn't be here, which means this is still my property until that proceeding is resolved. Get off it." Something moved behind Crowley's eyes. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He'd come up here expecting Nathaniel. He He was adjusting to something he hadn't fully prepared for. The challenge is a delay tactic, he said calmly. The commission will review it and dismiss it within 30 days. The underlying acquisition is clean. It isn't, Nathaniel said, and you know it isn't. The 1879 provisions are federal, and you know the territorial court doesn't have sole jurisdiction, and you've been hoping no one would catch that before you finished moving the pieces. That's an interesting interpretation, Crowley said. It's the correct one. What I find interesting, Crowley said, his voice not changing at all, still that same administrative calm, is that you filed under your full name after 6 years. That's a significant decision, Mr. Vossington. There are parties very interested in your reappearance, your family's attorneys, the trust administrators. He paused. The board of Vossington Northern. I'm aware of who will be interested, Nathaniel said. Then you're aware that your reappearance in the public record reopens the question of your obligations under the charter. There are outstanding motions regarding your trust position that were suspended in your absence. They won't remain suspended now. File them, Nathaniel said. Let the courts look at everything. Crowley tilted his head slightly. That's a bold position for a man who spent 6 years avoiding scrutiny. I haven't been avoiding scrutiny, Nathaniel said. I've been avoiding noise. Those are different things. Clara watched Crowley process that. He was very fast. She could see him working behind the calm, running lines of logic, checking angles. He was a man who operated by knowing more than the people across from him, and right now he was recalculating how much he actually knew. There's a simpler solution to all of this, Crowley said. He looked at Clara, then back at Nathaniel. You have a third of Vossington Northern's controlling interest. I have a railroad contract that needs right-of-way through this county. Those two facts could be reconciled in a manner that benefits everyone. The merger proposal, Nathaniel said. A partnership, Crowley said, as if the word choice mattered. Your family's infrastructure, my capital, and my contracts moving forward together. You'd be protected. Your son would be protected. Miss Whitmore's land question would become irrelevant since the right-of-way could be routed around existing registered homesteads. He paused. Everyone wins. Silence. The horses shifted. One of the four men moved slightly, and Clara felt without looking directly at them that the movement was the kind a man makes when he's repositioning in case he needs to move fast. Everyone wins, Clara said, except the people you already pushed off their land to get here. Crowley looked at her again. Miss Whitmore. Delacroix, she said. The Obert family. Patterson. Those people don't win in your proposal. Those are separate transactions. Conducted through 3 shell companies registered in 3 different counties, she said, funded through false freight accounts at a St. Louis bank, through accounts on Vossington Northern's own freight ledger. She watched his face. You want to tell me more about how clean the underlying acquisition is? The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Crowley went very still. The administrative calm didn't break. He was too controlled for that. But it went rigid in a way that was its own kind of tell. You've done your research, he said, finally. I've had help, she said. He looked at Nathaniel then, and for the first time the look was not administrative. It was personal. The look of a man who has been outsmarted and knows it and does not enjoy the experience. The documentation from Street. Lewis, he said. I wondered where that had gone. Nathaniel said nothing. The lawyer in Cheyenne, Crowley said. Ashford. I should have moved on that earlier. He wasn't talking to either of them now. He was talking to himself, a man recounting where the sequence had gone wrong. Then he pulled himself back. This doesn't have to end badly. For either of you. Get off my property, Clara said. A third time. Quiet and absolute. Crowley looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Nathaniel. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and mounted with the easy movement of a man who exercises good control of himself even when he's furious, which was, in its way, the most frightening thing he'd done since he arrived. This isn't over, he said, and the words weren't theatrical. They were just true, and all 3 of them knew it. He rode back down the trail with his 4 men around him. and the sound of the horses faded, and Clara stood on the porch until she couldn't hear them anymore. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed that and breathed through it. The shaking wasn't fear, or it wasn't only fear. It was the aftermath of standing in the open against something large and holding your ground, the body processing the fact that it had been ready to act and hadn't needed to yet. Yet. Nathaniel was beside her. He hadn't gone back inside. "You said yet," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "In your head. I can see you thinking it. Yet." He looked down the trail where Crowley had gone. "He won't come back the same way, not through the front." "No," she said. "He won't." "The documentation." "I told him more than we actually have confirmed," Clara said. "I wanted him to think we had the full chain. The freight account connection is in your wife's papers, but it's not complete. There are gaps." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You gambled." "I estimated," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd seen before, the one that got close but stopped just short, but it was closer this time than it had been before. "Ashford's reply came through Renfrew this morning," Nathaniel said, "before Crowley arrived. I didn't want to tell you with everything happening, but tell me now." "Ashford has the full chain," Nathaniel said. "My wife had it complete before she died. The freight account, the St. Louis bank, 2 names inside Vossington Northern who were running the laundering. She had all of it." He paused. "He's been sitting on it for 2 years waiting for someone to come back for it." Clara stood with that, the weight of it. The 2 years, the documentation, the woman she'd never met who'd spent the last months of her life building a case to protect strangers' land. "She was thorough," Clara said. "She was," Nathaniel said, and his voice went somewhere very quiet and very still on those 2 words. They stood on the porch together in the cold and looked at the place where Crowley's tracks were already filling in with the light snow that had started falling, covering the evidence of his presence. And Clara thought, "We have 12 days. We have Ashford. We have a filing and a federal provision and a dead woman's documentation and a man who just put his name back in the public record after 6 years of hiding." She thought, it might be enough. She thought, it has to be enough. "There's one more thing," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. His jaw was set in a way she recognized, the way it looked when he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. "When Crowley said the land question would become irrelevant if you agreed to the merger route," he said, "he wasn't lying about that part. There is a legitimate mechanism through the Railroad Commission where a formal merger agreement could resolve all of the territorial land questions in this county without going through the federal courts at all." He paused. "And I have the standing to force that mechanism, not by agreeing to the merger, by using the Vossington Trust position to formally object to Crowley's contract, which would trigger a federal review of his entire land acquisition record, not just the pieces we have documentation for." Clara looked at him. "You can do that?" "Yes." "What does it cost you?" He looked at her steadily. "It means stepping fully back in," he said. "Not just a filing. The board will convene. The trust administrators will want to meet. There will be proceedings that take months, probably a year, and during that time—" He stopped. "During that time, Eli and I aren't anonymous anymore. We're back. For real. Not as a temporary thing." Clara thought about Eli by the fire with his Wilkie Collins. She thought about Nathaniel fixing the floorboard and driving fence posts and cooking breakfast. She thought about the worn leather bag packed and waiting by the door. She thought about all of it. And then she thought about Marcel Delacroix, gone to Cheyenne, about the Ober family, about Patterson, about people she'd never met losing land they'd broken themselves to earn because one man had decided it was more valuable to him than it was to them. "Eli," she called. The front door opened. Eli stood in the doorway with the Collins novel and looked at both of them with those dark, too-old eyes. "You heard what your father just said," Claire said. It wasn't a question. "I heard," Eli said. "What do you think?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "I think," he said, "that it doesn't matter what our name is if we leave and people lose their land because we didn't stay." Nathaniel looked at his son. Clara looked at the trail where Crowley's tracks were filling in with snow. "Then we stay," Nathaniel said. His voice was different now. Not resolved exactly, but committed, which was its own different thing, the sound of a door being closed from the inside rather than slammed shut. The snow kept falling. The cabin held its warmth. And somewhere down in the valley, Garrett Crowley was riding back toward Coldwater Flats, with the beginning of the end of his plan already in motion, even if he didn't know it yet. 3 days after Crowley rode back down the mountain, the first act of retaliation arrived. Not as men on horses, which Clara had been watching for, but as paper, which was worse in its own way because you couldn't stand on your porch with a rifle and face paper down. The notice came through the county sheriff's office, delivered by a deputy named Goss, who Clara recognized from her supply runs. A young man, not unkind, who had the look of someone doing a job he didn't entirely like, but had signed on for and would see through. He handed her the envelope without quite meeting her eyes and said he was sorry and rode back down before she could ask him anything. She read it on the porch. Nathaniel came out and read it over her shoulder. It was a secondary filing, a motion contesting the federal jurisdiction challenge on procedural grounds, claiming that Nathaniel's filing was invalid because his reinstatement to active trust status had not been formally confirmed by the Washington Board, and therefore he did not currently hold the standing required to invoke federal provisions. It was exactly the kind of move that looked technical and boring, and was in fact a knife aimed at the one thing holding the whole situation together. "Is that true?" Clara said. "About the board confirmation?" "It's arguable," Nathaniel said. He said it in the tone of a man who knows the honest answer is complicated and is trying not to dress it up. "The charter language is ambiguous. My trust position was never formally dissolved, but active invocation of trust-level standing could be contested on the grounds that I've been absent from board participation for 6 years. So Crowley found the crack. "He found a crack," Nathaniel said. "It's not the same as the floor giving way. How do we close it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ashford needs to file a counter motion citing the specific charter provision that distinguishes between participation and ownership, but that requires him to have the charter documents, which are held by the Washington family attorneys in Denver. Can he get them?" "If I formally request them, which I've already sent word about this morning." He paused. "But there's a timing problem." There was always a timing problem. Clara had noticed this about legal fights. The calendar was a weapon, and the side with more money and more lawyers could almost always find ways to use time against you, stacking filings and motions and counter-motions until the sheer weight of accumulated delay crushed whoever was trying to hold on. "How much time?" she said. "Ashford thinks 3 days to get the charter documents, 2 more to prepare the counter-motion. The procedural window for filing is 7 days from today." He looked at her. "It's close." "Close is not impossible," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." She handed him back the notice and went inside to check on the bread she had rising, because the bread needed checking and because she had learned a long time ago that the only way to get through the kind of waiting that made your chest tight was to keep your hands occupied with something real. Eli was at the table doing sums in his head. She'd started giving him problems the same way Nathaniel did on the trail, partly because it kept him engaged, and partly, she admitted to herself, because she liked the focused quiet that came over his face when he was working. He was better at it than she'd expected, which she probably should have expected. "What's a procedural window?" he said, without looking up from the air in front of him where he was apparently doing arithmetic. "A deadline set by the court," Clara said. "And if we miss it?" "We don't miss it," she said. He looked up. He had a particular look he used for adults when they were being carefully reassuring in a way that didn't quite match the circumstances. Patient, not fooled, waiting for the real answer. "Ashford is fast," Nathaniel said from the doorway, "and the counter-motion is straightforward. We're not going to miss it." Eli seemed to decide this was sufficient. He went back to his arithmetic. But the days that followed were not straightforward, because nothing involving Garrett Crowley was ever straightforward, and Clara was beginning to understand that this was not incidental to his method. It was the method itself. Keep the other side moving in 3 directions at once. Keep them responding. Keep the cost of the fight high enough that even when you didn't win in court, you wore down the will of whoever was across from you. The second thing that arrived was smaller and uglier than the legal notice. Vera Hayworth, the dressmaker in Coldwater Flats who'd been sending Clara mending work for 8 months, sent a letter that Tuesday. It was not a long letter. It said that she was sorry, but she could no longer pass work to Clara, as she had been advised by certain business interests in town that this arrangement was creating complications. It did not say what kind of complications. It didn't need to. Clara read the letter twice, folded it, and set it on the shelf next to the legal notice. That was $60 a quarter. That was the margin she'd built her 2-year plan on. It was a small thing in the large picture of what Crowley was trying to do, but it was the kind of small thing that told you what kind of man you were dealing with. One who was thorough enough to cut the quiet threads, not just the visible ones. She stood at the window for a while, looking at the mountain. Then she put on her coat and went to find Nathaniel in the barn. He was working on the saddle. One of the straps had been showing wear for a week, and he'd been waiting for a clear hour to fix it properly. He looked up when she came in and read her face with the efficiency he had for that, and waited. She told him about the letter. She said it plainly, without dramatics, because that was how she handled things that hurt. Get them out in plain language, and then decide what to do. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "I'm sorry, that was because of me." "It was because of Crowley," she said, "which is because of me." Nathaniel. She said his name the way she sometimes did. Not sharp, not soft, just level, the way you speak to someone you need to pay attention. "I need you to stop apportioning blame and tell me what else he's likely to do. What's the next thing?" He set the saddle strap down. He thought about it with the focused quality he brought to problems, not performing thought, but actually doing it. "He'll try the community," he said. "He knows the legal route is contested. He'll start working on the people around you, not just Vera. He'll talk to whoever holds supply accounts, whoever you trade with, whoever might speak for you in town. He'll make staying here the kind of thing that costs you socially as well as financially." "Can he do that?" "He's done it before," Nathaniel said. "In 2 other counties. I've seen the pattern in the documents." Clara thought about Coldwater Flats. She thought about the people she knew there, which was not a large number because she'd spent 14 months being deliberately alone. Perry at the feed store. The sheriff, a man named Aldous Garth, who she'd spoken to twice and found to be a person of measurable fairness. A woman named Dora Marsh, who ran the boarding house and had a reputation for knowing everything that happened within 5 miles of town. She thought about the things she had that Crowley didn't expect her to have. Not money, not lawyers, not a name that meant anything to the Federal Railroad Commission. What she had was something less formal and harder to file a motion against. "I need to go to town," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Not to respond to him," she said. "I need to talk to people. The Obert family, are they still on their land?" "As of the last filing, yes. The forfeiture proceeding against them is behind yours in the queue." "And Patterson?" "Same." "Then I need to talk to them," Clara said, "and to Garth, and to whoever else in that town has been watching Crowley buy up land and wondering if they're next." She paused. "Because here is what I know about Garrett Crowley. From everything we've read about him, he has done all of this quietly. He has kept each acquisition separate. He has made sure that no one family knows what happened to the family next to them. He has operated in the space between people's awareness." She looked at Nathaniel steadily. "What happens when that space closes?" she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not quite the almost smile, something more serious than that, more like recognition. "Then he's not operating in the dark anymore," he said. "No," she said. "He isn't." She went the next morning alone because the road was hers to manage and because going with Nathaniel would have made it about Nathaniel, and this needed to be about the land. The ride down was 2 hours in cold that had eased slightly, still below freezing, but the particular brittle cold of deep January rather than the killing cold of the blizzard weeks. The kind you could move through and feel in your face and simply endure. She'd done harder things than a 2-hour ride in cold. She'd done harder things just in the past month. Coldwater Flats was not a large town. Main Street ran about 400 yards, and on it sat the feed store, the courthouse, a bank, 2 saloons, a barber, Vera's dressmaking shop, Dora Marsh's boarding house, and the telegraph office where Renfrew ran his unofficial federal line. The sheriff's office was at the east end, next to the jail, which was a small stone building that always had a look of mild apology about it, as if it regretted the necessity of its own existence. Clara went to the sheriff first. Aldous Garth was a man of about 60, large in a way that had softened with age, but not entirely, with white hair and the permanently sun-darkened skin of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. He was not a man who performed authority. He simply had it, the way a rock has weight, without effort, without announcement. He listened to everything she said, all of it. The documents, the shell companies, the tax note acquisition, the federal jurisdiction challenge, the counter-motion, what Crowley's method had done in the other 2 counties. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both focused on facts she could confirm, and he didn't ask anything she couldn't answer. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Oberts came to see me in November," he said. "Didn't know what to make of what was happening to them. I told them the filing looked legal and I couldn't do much with the legal filing." He paused. "I don't much like finding out it may not have been as clean as it looked." "There's a federal component," Clara said. "Ashford and Cheyenne has the documentation. Once the counter motion is filed—" "I understand," Garth said. He had the manner of a man who follows the thread of a situation without needing it laid out twice. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to know," she said. "And I need you to tell me if Crowley or any of his people do anything that gives you grounds to act. Because I think he's going to escalate. And when he does, I'd rather you know the full shape of things before it happens." Garth looked at her for a long moment. "You've been up on that mountain a long time, Miss Whitmore. Most people figured you were just waiting to sell." "I wasn't selling," she said. "I can see that." He stood. "I'll talk to the Oberts, and to a few other people who've had dealings with Crowley's companies that I've been meaning to look into." That was the best she'd get from him, and it was more than she'd expected. She thanked him and left. She went to Dora Marsh next, because Dora Marsh was the kind of woman who made information move through a community the way water moved through rock, slowly, persistently, and eventually through every crack. Dora was in her 50s, sharp-featured, not unkind, but not warm either, the warmth in her being of the practical variety. She housed people and fed them and kept their business to herself. And in exchange, she knew everything and had opinions she expressed precisely when she chose to. Clara sat at Dora's kitchen table and told the story a second time, shorter this time, hitting the load-bearing facts. Dora listened with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her eyes moving with the quality of someone scoring information as it came in. "Vera got a visit," Dora said when Clara finished. "Man named Holt, works for Crowley. Told her that her lease on the shop building, which is owned by a company in Rawlins, had a provision that could be invoked if she conducted business with parties involved in litigation against the lessor's principals." She paused. "She didn't know the company in Rawlins had any connection to Crowley. Neither did I until you just now told me." Clara sat with that. Another thread. Another quiet acquisition. The building that housed the dressmaking shop. "How many buildings on Main Street does he own?" she said. Dora looked at her. "That," she said, "is an excellent question, and I intend to find out." She stood up and refilled both their cups with the efficiency of a woman who processes information by moving. "You want to talk to the Oberts?" "Yes. They'll be at the feed store this afternoon. I'll make sure of it." She looked at Clara over her cup. "This man has been buying this town piece by piece for 2 years, and nobody saw the whole picture because he made sure nobody saw it." She said it with a kind of cold fury that was very controlled. The fury of a person who values knowing things and has discovered they've been kept from knowing something important. That changes today. It changed today. That was what Clara took back up the mountain with her that evening. Not a victory, nothing so clean as that, but the feeling of the ground shifting, of a weight that had been pressing on one point beginning to distribute, the way a structure holds better when it's shared. She got back to the cabin as the light was going and found Nathaniel and Eli eating dinner, and Eli looked up and said, "How did it go?" with the directness he brought to everything, and Clara sat down and told them both. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Garth is solid." "He is," she said, "and Dora Marsh is, I think she's angry in a way that's going to be useful." "Good," Nathaniel said, and she could hear in that single word that he meant it, that he was not the kind of man who needed to have been the one to go. who would have found something to resent in the fact that she'd done it herself. He just meant good. That night, a telegram arrived through Renfrew's line. Ashford had the charter documents. The countermotion was drafted. He would file in the morning within the procedural window, and he had added to it a formal federal fraud complaint based on Margaret Voss's documentation. The name, Clara noticed, that Nathaniel used when he referred to his wife in legal contexts, her full name. The one that appeared at the bottom of the documentation she'd spent her last months building. Clara read the telegram and passed it to Nathaniel. She watched him read it and watched his face do something careful and quiet with his wife's name. "She finished it," he said, almost to himself. "She did," Clara said. He folded the telegram and held it for a moment, and Clara looked away because some things deserved privacy, even when you were all living in the same small cabin. The town meeting happened the following week. It was not formally a town meeting. Coldwater Flats didn't have that kind of official civic infrastructure. It was more that Dora Marsh told people there would be coffee at the boarding house on Thursday evening and that there were matters of local land ownership that people with property in Harlan County might find relevant to understand. 15 families showed up, then 20. By 7 o'clock, the boarding house sitting room had people standing along the walls. Clara stood at the front of the room next to Sheriff Garth, who had spent the week doing exactly what he'd said he would, talking to people who'd had dealings with Crowley's companies, and she talked for 20 minutes about what she knew. The shell companies, the tax note acquisitions, the federal provisions. She named the families she knew about, the Oberts, Patterson, Delacroix. She told it plainly, without dramatic emphasis, because the plain facts were dramatic enough on their own, and people trusted plain better than performance. Nathaniel was in the room. He'd come in quietly and stood near the back and said nothing, not because he was hiding. His name was already in the federal filings, and Crowley knew exactly where he was, but because he understood without her having to say it that this was Clara's room to stand in. When she finished, a man near the window, stocky, 50 or so, the kind of weathered that comes from outdoor work, said, "My brother sold his place 2 counties over last spring, to a company out of Rawlins." He looked around the room. "I didn't know." "There was a provision in your brother's lease as well," Dora Marsh said from the side of the room. She had, in the week since Clara's visit, done a great deal of research into building and land ownership in the county. She had found 7 properties on Main Street with ownership chains that traced back to Crowley's companies. She said so, calmly, and the room absorbed it with the particular silence of people recalculating something they thought they'd understood. Garth spoke then. He said that the federal complaint was filed, that Ashford was representing the challenge, that the jurisdiction question would be before the commission within 30 days. He said, and he said it with the measured authority of a man who chose his words for accuracy rather than reassurance, that he could not promise outcomes, but he could promise that he was watching and that any action taken by Crowley or his associates that crossed into the territory of his jurisdiction would be met accordingly. It wasn't a promise of victory. It was a promise of a witness. Sometimes that was what you needed. Not someone to fight for you, but someone to stand there and see. Clara drove home with Nathaniel beside her on the road that had cleared enough for the wagon, and Eli was asleep in the back, wrapped in 2 blankets, having insisted on coming and then fallen asleep 10 minutes into the meeting, which Clara found privately very funny and said nothing about. "You didn't speak tonight," she said to Nathaniel. "You didn't need me to." "You could have. It might have carried weight. Your name, the trust position." "It might have so," he said. "But it also might have made it about me and the Vossington name instead of about the land and the people on it." He paused. "And that's not what it's about." She looked at the road ahead, at the mountain coming back into view as they turned north, dark against the lighter dark of the sky. "You knew that," she said. "That's why you stayed back." "Yes." She thought about a man who had a name that could fill a room and chose not to use it because the room needed something else. She thought about that choice and what it cost and what it said. She didn't say any of that. She drove the wagon up the road toward the ridge and thought it instead, and that was enough. 3 days later, Garrett Crowley made his last move. It came not through lawyers and not through men on horseback. It came at 2 a.m. when the cold was at its deepest and the road was empty and the cabin dark. A fire set at the base of the barn wall, mean, and deliberate. The kind of fire that wasn't meant to burn the building down immediately, but to put enough fear in a woman alone on a ridge that she would finally calculate the cost of staying and decide it was too high. Clara smelled it before she heard it, the smoke reaching her through whatever gap existed between the window and the sill. She was out of bed and into her boots and coat before she was fully awake, rifle in hand, moving through the cabin with the automatic efficiency of someone whose body had learned to respond to threat before the mind caught up. She woke Nathaniel with one word, and he was moving. They got the fire out, both of them, working the water barrels she kept outside for exactly this kind of emergency. The cold helping in the only way cold ever helped, the frozen ground and frozen air limiting how fast the flame could take hold. It took 20 minutes of hard work, and her arms ached afterward and her lungs burned from smoke and cold air combined. When it was done, they stood looking at the scorched base of the barn wall in the dark. Bess was restless inside, shifting and blowing. The hens were quiet, which meant they'd been quiet through it, which meant whoever had said it had known what they were doing. "He's running out of options," Nathaniel said. He said it quietly, not as comfort, just as analysis. "Men who are running out of options are the most dangerous kind," Clara said. "Yes." She looked at the char marks on the wall. She looked at the dark trail leading down to the road. She felt the anger in her chest, not the cold, useful kind she'd felt when she'd first understood what Crowley was doing, but something rawer than that, something more personal. This was her barn. This was where Bess lived, where the hens lived, where Moth conducted her nighttime business, where Nathaniel's horses were stabled. This was a place that had held warmth and work and life through the worst winter she'd had in years. "Get Eli up," she said. "He's sleeping in the cabin from now on, not the back room. And I want the supply of water barrels doubled before the week is out." Nathaniel nodded. "And in the morning," she said, "I'm writing down exactly what happened tonight, with the time and the method and the evidence, and it's going to Garth and to Ashford and to Renfrew's federal line. Everything." "Yes," Nathaniel said. She looked at the mountain above them, at the dark line of the ridge against the sky. The mountain had been trying to break her for 14 months. The winter had tried. The debt had tried. Loneliness had tried. And now a man who had never once set foot on her land was trying, through proxies and filings and fire in the night. She was still here. She turned and went back inside to write it all down, and the anger in her chest settled into something colder and more permanent as she wrote. And she told herself, this is the last thing he gets to do quietly. After this, nothing about Garrett Crowley happens in the dark. The report Clara sent to Garth the morning after the barn fire was 4 pages long and written in the kind of plain, specific language that made things difficult to dismiss. Times, observations, physical evidence, the char pattern on the wood that indicated where the fire had been started and with what. The boot prints she'd found in the snow at first light that matched neither hers nor Nathaniel's. The direction they led before the wind had softened them into illegibility. Garth rode up that afternoon with his deputy and looked at everything she'd described and said nothing for a long time, walking the perimeter, crouching near the marks, standing at the tree line where the prints ended and looking down toward the road with the expression of a man adding things up. "This is arson," he said, when he came back to where she and Nathaniel were standing. "Yes," Clara said. "I can't prove who sent whoever did this," he said. "Not from physical evidence alone." "I know," Clara said, "but it's in the record now. And when Ashford files the supplemental complaint with the Federal Commission, this goes in as part of the pattern, intimidation of parties to a federal proceeding." Garth looked at her steadily. "You've learned a lot about federal procedure in a short time." "I had a good teacher," she said, without looking at Nathaniel. The deputy photographed the burn marks. He had a camera, which Clara found mildly remarkable given the remoteness of the county seat. And Garth wrote his own report in a small notebook with a pencil he kept sharpened to a very fine point. And when he left, he said, "I'm going to have a conversation with Crowley." "What kind of conversation?" Nathaniel said. "The kind where I tell him that whatever he's been doing in other counties, I've been sheriff in Harlan County for 19 years. And anything that happens on land in my county gets my full and sustained attention." He paused. "The kind where I make clear that sustained attention is not something a man in his position wants from me right now." He rode down, and Clara watched him go and thought, 19 years. Garth had been sheriff here longer than Crowley had known this county existed. That was its own kind of weight. The next 10 days were a different kind of hard from everything before. Not the hard of crisis and immediate threat, but the hard of waiting, of watching the legal machinery move at its own pace while life continued around it. Nathaniel sent 3 more telegrams to Ashford. Ashford filed the supplemental complaint and then filed a motion to expedite the commission review given the evidence of active intimidation. The Vossington family attorneys in Denver, who had been notified of Nathaniel's reappearance in the public record, sent a letter that was cautious and measured, and which Nathaniel read twice and set aside without explaining what it said, though the set of his shoulders after he read it told Clara it was not a simple letter. "Your family," she said one evening. "My brother," he said. "He manages the day-to-day. He's not hostile, but he has questions." "That seems reasonable." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He wants to meet Eli." Clara let that sit. "When?" "Spring," he said. "If things are resolved here by spring." She looked at the window, at the dark outside that was slightly less dark than it had been a week ago. The days lengthening in the small, stubborn way of late January, the light returning by minutes rather than hours, but returning. "That's a reasonable thing for an uncle to want," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "I haven't told Eli yet." "You should," she said. "He handles things better when he knows them. You know that." Nathaniel held her eyes for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I know that." He told Eli the next morning, and Eli listened with his characteristic stillness and then said, "Is he nice?" "He can be," Nathaniel said. "That's not the same as being nice," Eli said. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It isn't." Eli considered this. "I'd like to meet him," he said finally. "I'd like to see where you came from, even if we're not going back to it." That last clause, "even if we're not going back to it," sat in the room for a moment. Clara was at the stove and didn't turn around. She wasn't sure what her face would do if she turned around just then. The commission ruling came on the first day of February. Renfrew brought it up himself, which told Clara something about what was in it before she read a word. Renfrew was not a man who made house calls. He was a thin, quiet man of about 45 who ran his telegraph office with the focused attention of someone who understood that information was serious and treated it accordingly. He arrived at the cabin mid-morning, tied his horse at the post, and handed the envelope to Clara with both hands in the manner of someone transferring something that deserved that care. She read it at the kitchen table with Nathaniel and Eli sitting across from her. The Federal Land Commission had upheld the jurisdiction challenge. The counter-motion had been denied. All forfeiture proceedings on properties acquired by Crowley's 3 land companies within Harlan County were suspended pending a full federal review, which would include examination of the acquisition methods, the source of funding, and compliance with the 1879 homestead provisions. The review was estimated to take 4 to 6 months and would require Crowley's companies to produce all acquisition documentation for commission examination. A separate notation at the bottom confirmed receipt of the federal fraud complaint based on documentation submitted by the estate of Margaret Voss, deceased, through attorney James Ashford of Cheyenne. That complaint had been forwarded to the relevant federal division for independent investigation. Clara set the papers down. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere on the property, she could hear wind moving through the pine trees, the ordinary sound of the mountain doing what the mountain did regardless of what happened in courtrooms and commission offices. "It's not finished," she said. "The review is 4 to 6 months, and anything can—" "Clara," Nathaniel said. She looked up. "Let it be good for a minute," he said, quietly. Not telling her what to feel, just asking her to let herself feel it. She looked at the paper. She thought about November 14th, the date Crowley had acquired her father's note. She thought about the night she'd stood at her window with a rifle and watched the dark. She thought about the barn wall scorched at 2 a.m. and the anger that had settled into her like a stone she'd been carrying ever since. She let herself feel it. 1 minute. The relief of it, which was complicated and incomplete and real. Then she said, "I need to go tell the Oberts." Eli said, "Can I come?" She looked at him. It's a long ride in cold. I know, he said. Yes, she said. Get your coat. They went to the Oberts first, then to Patterson, then back into Coldwater Flats to Dora Marsh, who absorbed the news with a nod and a small, controlled satisfaction that was the closest she came to visible emotion, and then said she'd see to it that anyone who needed to know would know by evening. Clara believed her. She stopped at Vera Hayworth's shop last. She wasn't entirely sure why. Vera had cut the mending work because she'd been pressured into it, which Clara understood and didn't hold. But she hadn't spoken to the woman since, and there was something unfinished in that. Vera was behind her counter when Clara came in, and she looked up with the expression of a woman who has been feeling guilty for 3 weeks and doesn't know how to address it. She was Clara's age or a few years older, practical looking, with the kind of capable hands that came from fine work done consistently over many years. I heard, Vera said before Clara could speak. Renfrew's been talking. She paused. Clara, I'm sorry. About the work. I should have told you what was happening instead of just sending the letter. You were protecting your business, Clara said. I understand it. I should have… Vera. Clara stopped her, not unkindly. I didn't come to make you feel bad about it. I came to ask if the arrangement can start again, once things have settled and Crowley's people aren't leaning on anyone over it. Vera looked at her for a moment. Then something in her face released. I have a backlog, she said. 3 weeks of alterations I've been managing badly without you. Send them up, Clara said. She walked out of the dressmaking shop into the cold, flat light of a February afternoon and stood on the street for a moment and thought, that's what this has always been. Not just the land, the work, the ordinary economic life of a woman on a mountain, the threads connecting her to town, to community, to the small, reliable dignity of doing something useful and being paid for it. Crowley had understood that those threads were part of what held her, and he'd tried to cut them, and they were still there. Eli was waiting at the horses. He looked at her face. Good? He said. Good, she said. Garrett Crowley left Harlan County on the 12th of February. He didn't announce it. He simply wasn't there anymore. His operation in the county seat shuttered, the man named Holt who'd done his local business gone with him. Garth confirmed it with the brevity of a man who found the information satisfying but wasn't going to make a speech about it. Crowley himself was not finished. The federal fraud investigation would follow him out of the county, and the commission review would produce findings that had implications well beyond Harlan. And there were attorneys now who had his company's full acquisition records and were asking careful questions in 3 other counties. He was a man with resources and he would fight it, and some of it would take years, and he would probably come out to the other end of it diminished but not destroyed. Clara had made her peace with that. She'd spent enough time on this mountain to understand that what you could do was change the ground under your own feet and the feet of the people near you. You couldn't always reach the whole story to its ending. Sometimes you got justice in pieces, and the pieces mattered even when they weren't the whole picture. What was whole? What was complete? What was hers, without question, was the land. In March, when the commission confirmed the suspension of all forfeiture proceedings, and Ashford filed the documentation that formally cleared the Whitmore title, Clara stood in her father's kitchen and held the paper that said the land was hers, and felt something she hadn't felt in 14 months. Not relief, something different from relief, something that lived underneath relief. The thing that relief is the surface expression of. She'd been holding on so long that letting herself feel safe felt almost like a physical change in her body, like a muscle releasing that she hadn't known was clenched. She put the paper in the tin box under the floorboard, the same floorboard Nathaniel had repaired in the first week of his being here, the nails set clean and square, the wood no longer giving underfoot. And she closed it and stood up and went to make coffee. Nathaniel had been staying, not by formal arrangement, not by conversation exactly. It had happened the way water happening through rock happened, gradually and then completely. He'd been here through the federal filings and through Crowley's departure and through the long waiting of February, and at some point the question of when he was leaving had stopped being a present tense question and become something else, something that didn't have a clean grammatical category yet. He was in the barn. He spent a lot of time in the barn, not avoiding the cabin, but working, always working, the way Clara worked, the way people work when they've found a place that seems to deserve the effort. She brought 2 cups of coffee out to the barn and set one on the post near where he was working and stood with hers. "The title's clear," she said. He looked up. Something moved through his face that she'd come to know, the shift that happened when he felt something significant and didn't perform it. "Good," he said, just that. But the way he said it, "Ashford's sending the final documentation next week. He wants a conversation about the Vossington Trust obligations. The board wants a formal position from you before spring." "I know." He set down what he was holding. "I've been thinking about that." And I think I need to deal with it properly. Go to Denver, sit with the attorneys and the board, and sort out what obligations I actually have versus what they want me to have." He paused. "It's not going to be a simple conversation." "No," she said. "I wouldn't think so. It might take a few weeks." He looked at her directly. "Eli would stay here, if you're willing. He'd be more disrupted by the board meetings than helped by them. And He stopped. "He's happy here. More than he's been in a long time." Clara looked at her coffee cup. She thought about what it meant that this man trusted her with his son for a few weeks. She thought about what it meant that she didn't have to think twice about it. "Eli can stay," she said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Clara," she looked up. "When I come back from Denver," he said, "I'd like to talk about the longer shape of things, if you're willing to have that conversation." She knew what he meant. He meant the shape of things that included more than winter and legal filings and emergency water barrels and 2 people managing a crisis alongside each other. He meant the shape of things that extended into spring and further than spring. She felt something tighten in her chest and then release. The way the land title had released something. Not romantic feeling exactly, or not only that, but the particular fear that comes from wanting something and not yet knowing if it's safe to want it. She had been alone on this mountain for 14 months. She had been alone, in the deeper sense, longer than that. She had built her self-sufficiency like a wall because she'd needed the wall, and the wall had held her upright through things that would have knocked her down without it. But a wall was not a home. She'd been confusing those 2 things for long enough that she wasn't always sure which was which anymore. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded once. He didn't overdo it. She gave him credit for that. He left for Denver on a Thursday in late March when the road was solid and the weather held clear. Eli stood at the cabin door and watched him ride down and then turned back inside with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who has made many departures and knows arrivals follow. "He'll be back in 3 weeks, Eli said, like he was reminding himself. 3 weeks, Clara confirmed. "Okay," Eli said, and picked up his current book. He'd worked through Collins and moved on to something else she'd recommended, a collection she'd had since her mother's time, and sat by the fire with the cat and settled in. Those 3 weeks were good ones. Clara would think about them later, in the way you think about stretches of time that were not dramatic but were somehow foundational, the kind of time that doesn't make for a story but makes you. She and Eli worked the property together. He was stronger than he looked and willing to do what was asked without complaint, and he had his father's quality of doing things correctly without needing to be shown twice. She taught him to check Bess's hooves, which he did with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. He taught her a mental arithmetic game his father had invented on their long rides, which she was worse at than she expected, and he was generous about. He asked her once, about a week in, "Did you want a family?" Before. She was splitting kindling when he asked it. She set the hatchet down. "I thought I did," she said. "When I was younger. Then I lost the people I had, and I think I decided wanting more people was too costly. The losing part." Eli thought about this. "My pa said something like that once, that he decided after my mother died that he was done wanting things for himself, that it was safer to just want things for me." Clara looked at him. "I told him that was sad," Eli said. "He said it wasn't sad, it was practical. I told him practical and sad weren't different things." She stood with that for a moment. "What did he say?" "He didn't say anything," Eli said. "He just looked at me for a long time. And then he made breakfast." Clara picked up the hatchet. She thought about Nathaniel making breakfast after a conversation like that, the way he moved around a kitchen, quiet and functional, working through something in the doing of ordinary things. She thought about the first morning, the coffee already on when she woke. "You were right," she said. "It is sad." "I know," Eli said. "I think he knows it too now." She finished the kindling and they went inside, and she thought about walls and homes and the difference between them, and about how sometimes you have to let a wall become something more permeable before it can become a door. Nathaniel came back on a Wednesday, as he'd said, in the late afternoon with the light going gold over the ridge the way it did in early April, when the season was finally turning for real, not the false turns of February, but the real one, the one the mountain meant. He rode up and dismounted and handed her a packet of papers from Ashford, the final documentation, everything in order, and then said, "The board was difficult." "I expected they would be," she said. "I made an agreement with them. Formal reinstatement to trust participation, quarterly board attendance, final say over any Vossington Northern contracts that interact with federal land provisions." He paused. "In exchange, they acknowledged my right to live where I choose and raise Eli as I see fit, and they formally withdrew the outstanding motions regarding my absence." "That's what you wanted?" "That's what I could get that was also what I wanted," he said, "which is about as well as those things usually line up." She accepted that distinction. It was an honest one. Eli appeared from the barn where he'd apparently heard the horse and come running, which he would have denied if she'd described it that way, and Nathaniel caught him in something that wasn't quite an embrace because neither of them were demonstrative, but was undeniably that in every way that counted. "You were gone 22 days, Eli said into his father's shoulder. "You said 3 weeks." 3 weeks is 21 days, Nathaniel said. "I was 1 day over." "That's still over," Eli said, pulling back, straightening himself, reassembling his composure. "It is," Nathaniel agreed. "I'm sorry." Eli looked at him for a moment, then, "Moth had kittens." Nathaniel looked at Clara. 2 nights ago," she said. 3 of them. We're still negotiating over names." He looked back at Eli. "Are we keeping them?" "Yes," Eli said, with the finality of someone for whom this was not actually a question. Nathaniel looked at Clara again over Eli's head. 2 votes to 1, she said. "I wasn't going to win." He almost smiled. "Closer than before. Almost there." That evening, after dinner, after Eli had gone to check on the kittens for the 4th time and finally stayed in the back with them, Nathaniel and Clara sat by the fire in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through a considerable amount together and have arrived somewhere on the other side of it. "The conversation," Clara said. "The one you mentioned before you left." "Yes. Have it now." He looked at the fire for a moment. He was not a man who prepared speeches. She'd known this about him for a long time, had come to trust it. What he said was what he thought, not what he'd practiced. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I did it before, and I was lucky in who I chose, and I wasn't always as good to her as she deserved. And then she was gone, and I decided the conclusion to draw was that I shouldn't try again." He paused. "Eli told you that." "He did." "He was right. It is sad." He looked at her. "I've been watching you for 4 months, the way you work, the way you make decisions, the way you talk to my son." He stopped. "The way you stood at that door on the worst night we'd had, with a rifle and every reason in the world to keep it closed, and you opened it anyway." Clara sat with that. "That wasn't wisdom," she said. "I didn't know what I was doing. I heard a child cough." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at the fire. She thought about what she'd told Eli, that she'd decided wanting more people was too costly, that the losing part was too high a price. She thought about 14 months on a mountain counting eggs and rationing lamp oil and talking to a cow and a cat, building her sufficiency taller and thicker and calling it strength. It was strength. She didn't want to unsay that. What she'd done here was real, and it had cost her, and she hadn't broken. But she thought about what Eli had said. Practical and sad aren't different things. And she thought about the fire in the hearth and the kittens in the back room, and the man across from her who had driven fence posts and cooked breakfast and filed federal motions under a name he'd been hiding from for 6 years. And she thought, the wall held me up. It did what it was supposed to do. But I'm still standing. I don't need it to be this high anymore. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I need you to know that before anything. I'm stubborn and I have opinions and I don't ask for help naturally, and there will be mornings when I've worked through something completely on my own before I think to tell you about it. I know, he said. I'm not finished, she said. I've been here alone long enough that I don't always know the difference between needing space and building walls, and I'll need someone willing to tell me when they think I'm confusing those two things. I can do that, he said, if you'll do the same for me. I disappear inward when things get hard. I make decisions that affect people without thinking to consult them first. I kept my name from you for 2 weeks when I should have told you sooner. Yes, she said, you should have. I know. He looked at her directly. I'm better at actions than I am at words. I don't know if that evens out. She thought about the floorboard, and the fence, and the hinge, and the kitten's father being walked out of the barn by Eli every morning so the horse could have clean air. She thought about the telegram filed under his wife's full name, Margaret Voss, deceased, and what it cost to write that with precision when it would have been easier not to. It evens out, she said. Spring came to Harlan's back the way spring always did in Wyoming. Reluctantly, then all at once, the snow retreating up the mountain foot by foot, until one morning in late April, you woke up and the ground was visible, and the mud was everywhere, and the world smelled like cold water and green things, and the particular aliveness of soil that has been frozen for 5 months and is now remembering what it is. Clara's land was hers. The title was recorded in the Federal Land Commission's registry under her name, uncontested and fully clear, and Ashford had sent a letter confirming that 3 of the families displaced by Crowley's operations in Harlan County had had their properties returned or been compensated through the Commission's restitution process. Patterson had come back to her land. The Aubers were still there. Marcel Delacroix's daughter, it turned out, had wanted to return for a year, and her father had told her there was nothing to come back to. He'd been wrong. Not everyone had been made whole. 2 families were gone too completely. Land sold, lives rebuilt elsewhere. The departure too permanent to reverse. That was the part that didn't resolve cleanly, that Clara held with the specific weight of things that can't be fixed but must be remembered. Justice in pieces, like she'd known it would be. The pieces mattered. The gaps mattered too. Nathaniel built a second room onto the cabin in May. Not in a weekend, not with miraculous speed, but over the course of 3 weeks, working correctly and carefully, and it was not beautiful when it was done. The proportions were slightly off on the east wall, and one of the window frames required 2 adjustments before it sat right. But it was solid, and it was real, and it was part of the cabin now. Eli named 2 of the kittens and let Moth name the 3rd in the way cats name things, which was by ignoring it entirely until it became clear the kitten was simply going to stay. The board meetings in Denver were what they were. Nathaniel went twice before the end of summer and came back each time with the particular tiredness of a man doing something he finds necessary but not natural, and Clara made coffee and didn't ask more than he wanted to tell, and told herself that was a form of love too, knowing what a person needed versus what you wanted to give them. She thought about her father sometimes, about the debt he'd left, and the land he'd almost lost through carelessness or bad luck, or whatever combination had put him in Crowley's path. She didn't spend much time being angry about it anymore. He'd been a man with limitations, as all people were, and he'd loved her in the ways he knew how, and he'd left her the cabin, and the cabin had been enough. The cabin had been, in the end, everything. She thought about the knock at the door in the blizzard. She thought about 3 fists hammering against the wood in the dark, and a child's cough, and the 3 seconds she'd stood with her hand on the bolt, asking herself what kind of person she was. She thought she was opening the door to give someone shelter. She hadn't understood yet that she was also opening a door inside herself that she'd pulled shut so long ago she'd half forgotten it was there. The one that let people in, that let belonging happen, that let the ordinary mess and difficulty of other human beings become your mess and difficulty too, which was the only way it ever became your joy as well. That was the thing she hadn't known she was missing. Not company, not help exactly, though she'd needed both. It was the specific weight of being known by someone who stayed, who saw the ledger with the debt, and the cracked window patched with newspaper and the 14 months of white-knuckle survival and didn't decide it was too much, who looked at all of it and said, "I'm not leaving." She thought, "You can be strong enough to hold on alone, and strong enough is real and worth being proud of. But strength was never meant to be the whole life. It was supposed to be the thing that kept you standing until the life arrived." On a morning in late June, Clara stood at the window of her cabin. The cabin that had a new room now, that had coffee on and kittens on the furniture, and a man in the barn starting the day's first work, and a boy somewhere arguing with a horse about whether the horse needed to come in from the field. And she looked at the mountain. Harlan's back looked back at her the way it always had. Indifferent, enormous, asking nothing except that she be strong enough to deserve it. She was. She was still standing, and standing beside her now, finally, was a life that was more than just that. She'd opened the door in the dark because a child coughed. She had not been wise. She had not been strategic. She had been human, in the deepest sense of that word, moved by something small and helpless, responding before she could talk herself out of it, letting instinct lead where calculation would have said stop. She thought about that a lot. In the quiet way she thought about things that had changed her. The decisions that make you aren't always the ones you agonize over. Sometimes they're the ones you make in 3 seconds with your hand on a bolt and the wind screaming and your father's voice in your head telling you to keep it closed. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't the dramatic stand in the town square or the federal filing or the woman holding her rifle steady on a porch. Sometimes it's just the door, the opening of it, the willingness to let what's outside come in, even when you're afraid, even when you can't see clearly, even when you've been burned before and your whole body is saying don't. She turned from the window and poured 2 cups of coffee and put on her coat and carried them out to the barn, through the mud and the morning light and the smell of spring on a Wyoming mountain, toward the sound of work being done by someone who had become hers to walk toward. The storm had brought a stranger to her door, and she had been brave enough, not wise, not certain, just brave enough to let him in. That was all it ever takes, that one moment of enough.